In many ways, there is a willful blindness that enables the perpetuation of slavery's legacy. For slave trading nations, the open wound will not heal. And no, just saying sorry for slavery is not enough. In this 13th session of the series, Time for the Nations to Reap, we will talk about the hidden Hebrews in Amsterdam and why the Dutch tried to hide this information.
The King of the Netherlands is apologizing for his country's role in the global slave trade. Now, King Willem-Alexander also asked for forgiveness for his ancestors profiting off that slave trade and doing nothing to stop it. The Netherlands outlawed slavery some 160 years ago, but it is estimated that the royal family earned the equivalent of $600 million in taxes and other fees from Dutch colonies that practiced slavery. Listen.
The horrors of slavery in the past. The consequences of this can still be felt today in racism in our society. On December 19th last year, the Prime Minister apologized on the behalf of the Dutch government for the fact that people, in the name of the Dutch state, were made into commodities, exploited, and mistreated for centuries. Today, I stand here before you as your king and as part of the government. And today, I make these apologies myself.
So the king is saying sorry after they made over $600 million from slavery. And we all know that that's a very conservative estimate. Notice that reparations did not come up at all. Did you know that the Dutch tried to hide the fact that they even had slaves in their country? Not only did they try to cover up that fact, they also knew that those enslaved people were Israelites. We're going to talk about that and how they profited from slavery in a way that is never talked about. So let's get into this. I'll begin by reading an excerpt from this BBC article entitled, "Not Enough to Say Sorry for Slavery Links." Professor Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, says, "Unfortunately, one cannot go back and remake the history, but you can make atonement. It is not enough to make your apology as a public spectacle. It is not enough to present it as public relations exercise." I'll drop down. He says all the institutions that created this mess really have to come and help in practical ways to clean it up. Now, I've said some time ago that these apologies seem very insincere. And honestly, just saying you're sorry is not enough unless you're willing to back it up with actions. Bring the fruit of repentance. Put your money where your mouth is, in other words. So the Dutch king says they are sorry, but they're not sorry enough to get rid of one of their beloved traditions that reinforce negative stereotypes about our people. Let's read some excerpts from this article entitled, "Inside the Black Pete Tradition of Christmas Blackface in the Netherlands." The caption says, "Dutch Christmas traditions have long included a black-faced servant known as Zwart or Black Pete, but anti-racism activists are now calling for this to end." Now, what's interesting is that in 2015, the UN committee urged the Netherlands to drop this Black Pete character from the Sinterklaas celebrations because of its racist stereotyping of black people. But did they? No. So let's look at the origins of this tradition. It says a Sinterklaas helper was first mentioned in 1800, though there was no description of his physical appearance. By the 1820s, the new character was described as a curly-haired Negro, and he became known as Zwart Pete or Black Pete. The first illustration of this dark-skinned helper appeared in a children's book about Santa Claus in 1850, written by Jan Schnankman. Zwart Piet is described as a bumbling Moor from Spain, so a stupid Moor from Spain, who carries Santa Claus's heavy load of presents, wrap gifts, and kidnaps naughty children to punish them. So what are they implanting in the minds of these children about people with dark skin? Listen, it says in November, parades are held across the Netherlands to celebrate Santa Claus. Those cosplaying as Zwart Piet are usually white people dressed in outlandish costumes, afro wigs, and red lipstick. Just imagine what this event is like. You have thousands of white Dutch people in blackface during this parade. It says they paint their faces black to match the character. Zwart Piet impersonators also speak in Afro-Caribbean accents, further emphasizing the racialization of the character. The tradition has come under fire in recent years. More and more people have called out the Zwart Piet costumes as blackface, a racist caricature portrayal of black people performed by non-black people. This reckoning has gained steam as the Netherlands, which has a long history of colonialism and involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, has become home to a more diverse population. Let's look at this article from World Atlas to see how the Dutch colonial empire began. It says the Dutch colonial empire began in 1588 when the Netherlands united in declaring its independence from Spain, forming what was known as the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. The Dutch Empire eventually became one of the world's most powerful colonial powers, with outposts in 5 continents: Asia, Africa, North America, and South America. During its height, the Dutch colonial empire included territories scattered around the globe in countries as far-reaching as Indonesia, Suriname, South Africa, the United States, and many countries in South America. With its expansive trade network, the Dutch Empire became a major player in the global economy, becoming known for its lucrative spice trade. Additionally, many of the colonies developed under Dutch rule adopted aspects of their colonizers' culture and language. The legacy of Dutch colonialism can still be seen around the world today. In short, the Dutch colonial empire was an influential part of history, and its impact is still evident in the modern world. Indeed, it is impossible to know to what extent the Dutch colonial empire impacted the regions it occupied. However, one thing is clear: those regions were forever changed. And this portion of it may be interesting to some who did not know that New York once belonged to the Dutch. It says the Dutch began colonizing North America in 1609. This early colonization began with the founding of New Amsterdam, more commonly known in our modern day as Manhattan, New York, by the Dutch West India Company in 1625. The Dutch also established several other settlements in what is now upstate and downstate New York, as well as in Delaware, Pennsylvania, and other areas along the East Coast. These settlements were often very profitable for the Dutch, thanks to the trading of furs and other commodities. However, These early Dutch settlements were eventually ceded to the British and became part of the United States of America. Now let's shift just a bit. I want to share some information from this journal article entitled Access to the Netherlands of Enslaved and Free Black Africans, Exploring Legal and Social Historical Practices in the 16th through the 19th centuries. It's dealing with how the Dutch classified people who were enslaved. And it also gives us some insights into how they managed to hide the fact that slaves were in the Netherlands. Let's read this. Dutch merchant and maritime history includes a black presence from the 16th century onwards. As a country that self-identifies as freedom-loving, the Dutch involvement in the slave trade and slavery creates a problem of justification within the Netherlands. This article explores the development of legal history as well as individual case histories. Slaves could obtain freedom from their owners as a result of an owner's individual decision by marriage, by baptism, by remaining in the Netherlands long enough, or when their enslaved parents were freed. The Dutch authorities attempted to keep the involvement in slavery out of sight in the Netherlands. Don't miss that. The small presence of blacks in the country was the result of a highly selective process of enabling and restricting access. The Netherlands remained white for centuries in spite of its colonial empire, but not entirely. So this article presents the long absence of visibly black communities in Europe as the result of practical restrictions as well as conscious legal exclusion. So listen, I found this part to be very interesting. It says, in the early modern Atlantic world, the terminology of the legal status of Africans became entangled with the terminology of color. In Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Dutch, the European languages most directly connected to the history of enslavement, the terminology is remarkably similar. Listen, the Portuguese were the first to coin the terms, and other Europeans easily integrated them into their own languages. For example, as Linda Haywood and John Thornton point out, the terms Negroes, Negar, and Neger were borrowed directly from the Portuguese and had no meaning in Dutch or English until the middle of the 16th century, when speakers of both languages began visiting those areas in Africa frequented by the Portuguese, no meaning other than black, that is. But at some point during the 16th century, the term Negro took on a second meaning of slave, when referring to people that might even be independent of skin color. In the Netherlands, black Africans were named by direct indications of their dark color, Zwarten and Zwartenen and Negroes. As long as they were regarded as remarkable, listen, as long as they were regarded as remarkable, their presence as blacks was noted in various sources, enabling us to reconstruct some of their histories today. But listen to this. When the black presence became less remarkable, the relevance of race and visible difference seems to have disappeared from view in the sources because it was simply not mentioned. This is one of the paradoxes in the study of black Europeans. Black Europeans. Legal sources vary as to whether or not blackness as such is mentioned. Sometimes there is no indication at all of the African origin of persons in a court case. Their names are European, Christian, and their birth and their place of birth or region of origin is not named. Now let's talk about slaves in the Netherlands. It says forms of human bondage, servitude, and slavery were found across medieval Europe. In the International Historiography of Modern Europe, this was forgotten after the enslavement of black Africans became the dominant phenomenon. Stephen A. Epstein has shown the continuities and connections between pre-modern and modern slavery in Europe, both in language and in numbers. Slavery and slaves were present in the world that Columbus grew up in. European expansion created a convenient division of events in history between here in the Old World and there across the sea. The idea was that there was no slavery in the Netherlands. Slavery came to appear as something outside Europe, far away. Have you ever wondered why they did that? For the most part, they trafficked enslaved people to other locations. So it says, the study of history becomes split as well between those who study and write about national issues in Europe and others who focus on colonial or non-Western history. The history of slavery and the slave trade thus becomes situated outside Europe as an element of African, Caribbean, or American history, and this continues throughout the 20th century and during decolonization. Let's go on. It says recent research shows that in the late 17th and 18th centuries, there were black African slaves present in the Netherlands. So how did they get there? Their presence as slaves was controversial and their legal status created uncertainty. The first captain who brought a group of black African slaves to the city of Middelburg in Zeeland in 1596 was told that they could not stay there as enslaved. The local authorities announced their liberation. However, this did not happen. Instead, when the Dutch captain Peter van der Hagen requested permission to take the ship with its crew and the Moors to Portugal and the West Indies, the National States General first refused, then allowed the captain to do as he pleased, which was to take the slaves to the West Indies. The article says the first black Africans came from Spain or Portugal. Now again, if you listen to the previous sessions, we talked about the identity of the so-called black Africans who were trying to get out of Spain and Portugal. So they went to the Netherlands, England, and Germany in the context of North European contact and competition with South European merchants. Listen to this. Some, but by no means the majority of the slaveholders, were part of the Sephardic diaspora that facilitated trade and colonization in the Portuguese Atlantic. So who were the Sephardic helping to facilitate the trade and colonization in the Portuguese Atlantic? We're going to look at that on the live this coming Wednesday, Yah willing. Because BB is also saying that he is Sephardic. This article comes from the Times of Israel, and it says, he revealed that his roots go back to Spain. So we need to talk about this. Let's go on. It says by the early 17th century, quite a few black Africans had found their way to the city of Amsterdam. Dozens of black Africans, enslaved and free, listen, were buried at Beth Haim, the Portuguese Jewish cemetery of Amsterdam. Why were they buried at the Portuguese Jewish cemetery, family? It says they were named and described by their skin color as Swarten and Swartenen, Negros and Negrenin, and their legal status was often uncertain. Ad hoc decisions characterized emerging legislation, as in the case of 4 Portuguese merchants in Amsterdam, and it lists these merchants who left statements with Amsterdam notaries in February of 1626, having survived piracy and the takeover of their ship by Dutch privateers. They arrived in the city with several black African men and women. In October of 1625, Drago and Alvin came to Europe, first to Portugal, then to the Netherlands. Arriving in Vlissingen, some went south to Rouen in France, others to Amsterdam. So when they got there, it says the rest of the crew were released, each with 1 Spanish pistole in money. The others of the crew went to Rouen. He and Alvin went to Amsterdam with 3 Negroes and 5 Negresses, or women, black women, that belonged to Alvin. All declare that Alvin remained in Amsterdam with the 8 Negroes for about 3 months, and that he was free to go where he pleased, and that he could leave with them whenever he wanted. Now listen to what it says. That last sentence is important, as this makes clear that the status of these African men and women as property of the Portuguese merchants had not changed during their stay in Amsterdam. So the government was basically looking the other way. It says it is likely that the 4 Portuguese merchants had gone to the notary in order to have this confirmed in writing. Although indications of skin color and servant status can be found, listen, the Portuguese word for slave vanished from the burial records after 1617. Now that's important. That is very important. Why? It says, why the word for slave would be avoided has not been ascertained, but there could be a connection with the Dutch and Amsterdam authorities' wish that slavery and slaves would be absent from Dutch soil, possibly to avoid controversy about the ambivalent status of slaves. This ambivalence is also clear in a case from 1656. Listen, the explicit documented presence of black Jews, slaves and servants in the Amsterdam Portuguese cemetery records of the early 17th century stands in contrast to their absence from the same records in the 18th century. So they had records of them being there in the 17th century, but couldn't find any reference to them by the 18th century. It says, for the beginning of the 18th century, very few specific references to black people can be found. So what happened to them? Neither is there an indication of a separate area for black Africans in this cemetery. The designations black, slave, or servant noted their separate and inferior status and justified their being buried apart. As far as we know, these rules were not formally changed. One explanation could be that this had become customary practice, but this is a subject for further research. So let's find out a little more about this cemetery. This information comes from jta.org. It says a Dutch Jewish cemetery has become a black pilgrimage site. Listen to this. Each year on the last Wednesday of June, dozens of people arrive by boat at the Jewish cemetery of this picturesque town near Amsterdam to commemorate their ancestors. But listen to this. The visitors are almost all black. None are Jewish. None are Jewish? And they're going to a Jewish cemetery? Because when they say none are Jewish, they're saying none look like Europeans or like Ashkenazis, because the world believes that's what the ancient people look like. So why are they coming then? Why are these black people going to this cemetery? It says for the past decade, they've been coming to Beth Haim, the oldest Jewish cemetery in the Netherlands, because of the discovery here in 2002 of Holland's earliest known grave of a former slave, a man named Eleazar. He died in 1629 and was brought here from Portugal by his Jewish masters, who are buried right alongside him. And it gets even stranger. Listen up. So Lydia Haggard, the historian who discovered the gravestone, says Eleazar's life reflects his acceptance as an equal and integration into the Jewish Portuguese family that owned him. It says Eleazar came to the Netherlands in 1610. That's an interesting year. So it says he came as a slave to the family of Paulo de Pina. He is buried alongside his owner, but also next to Jacob Israel Belmont, once the community's richest businessman. This means Eleazar was converted to Judaism and widely accepted as Jewish. Otherwise, listen, he would not have been buried inside the Jewish cemetery. Moreover, de Pina's family must have paid extra to have him buried alongside them in a prestigious plot. It's revealing that the Belmont family didn't object to having Eleazar buried alongside them, Haggard says. Listen, slavery never existed officially in the Netherlands, so Eleazar's legal status was somewhat vague. The authorities did not classify him as belonging to the de Pinas. He attended the funeral of the wife of his master, Sarah de Pina, and contributed to that occasion 6 stuivers, a Dutch coin of the era, she said. That act suggests that Eleazar was on or near equal footing with the family that owned him back in Portugal. You all, if his status is vague, how can they say for sure he was a slave? They say it because it fits the narrative. You're telling me that this man was so special to this family that they paid extra to have him buried with them? No, this is what you do for family. She said he was on or near equal footing with this family. Then why was he their slave? It's not adding up. No, a distinction is being made here between Israelites that converted to Catholicism and those who did not. And I've already shared sources and pictures showing what the quote-unquote Portuguese Jews looked like. They had dark, swarthy skin. They looked like Negroes. So let's go back to the article. All right, let's keep going. It says Amsterdam notary archives document the presence of black men and women, frequently showing that there were both individuals and groups of free black women and men. These black Africans lived in Amsterdam as free people, away from their former masters or owners. How had they obtained freedom? We know that they sometimes received benefits from the Jewish poor service, the imposta, that their funerals were paid for. So it talks about the period from 1629 to 1634 when benefits were paid by this organization, the imposta, and they were paying to free people to buy their freedom. It says the imposta's accounts included an intriguing sum of 12 guilders and 10 stuvers per assoltar o preto to buy freedom for the black man. So that's what this meant, to buy freedom for the black man. Pause and think on that. Are these Israelites buying the freedom of other Israelites? It says, would the Jewish poor service spend money on buying slaves their freedom from Jewish owners? Haggard found no manumission letters or forms, though these may be found elsewhere in Europe. She explained this absence of paperwork by pointing out that slavery did not officially exist. So since it didn't exist, they didn't have to keep records, in other words. So no official emancipation or liberation was possible, and everything remained informal. This is interesting, family. It says in the last quarter of the 18th century, the inhumane status of enslaved Africans and the system of individual privileges for favorites was interrupted when several European nations, including France and Portugal, designed new rules regarding the access of slaves to the metropole. This included the establishment in France of depots where blacks reaching European soil were incarcerated until they could be returned to the colonies. In the Dutch West Indian colonies, local authorities coined laws to manage the enslaved population. Among the first rules was the permission to travel. Slaves could travel with their masters provided that he requested a passport in time for the slave. In Caraco in 1638, marriage with local indigenous women or black women was only allowed when the women had a Christian education, were christened, and became members of the Christian community. The same rule was formulated and confirmed unchanged in 1739. In 1742, all Negroes and mulattoes going on any ship had to prove that they were free, following disorder among the free and the enslaved on ships. A man could marry when he was 14 years old and a woman when she was 12 years old, provided their parents give their consent. The age for witnesses was a minimum of 18 years old. These rules appear to have been similarly inspired as those in the East Indies, aimed at stabilizing the colony by encouraging marriages. But listen, the double standard regarding mixed marriages is clear. The white rulers facilitated marriages between white men and black women, but prohibited marriages between white women and black men. So listen to what was going on in the Netherlands. It says, in the Netherlands, as in the Americas, the ideas that slaves were not ready for emancipation can be found as a standard statement until the very days the laws were changed. Even in 1863, the Dutch authorities resisted full emancipation for another decade, during which the formerly freed men and women were, as a group, placed under supervision. So they considered them to be animals or children. And if you classify a person that way, then you need a guardian, right, to govern their affairs, because certainly an object or an animal can't do that. So it says, as late as 1825, the full humanity of slaves was still rejected in law, as when the head of Suriname's tax office wrote to the governor of Suriname that slaves could not share in those rights which assumed the legal personality of the one to enjoy them, because such a personality cannot be assigned to any being which is considered a thing, an object. So in 1828, this special envoy to the King of the Netherlands wrote this. He published a new set of rules, and he says, the slaves will be considering their daily treatment regarded to stand in relation to their owners as under age, their children, to their curators or guardians, who retain fatherly disciplinary jurisdiction over them, but against whose abuse all public authorities are obliged to guard and to watch that the law designed in their interest is strictly upheld. Thus from now on the unjust principle that in legal affairs, slaves can only be regarded as objects and not as persons is permanently abolished. It says the crucial moment of the legal recognition of slaves as human beings coincided with the announcement of their new status as underage children. Just think about that. Think about how they called black men boy and the women girl or gal. They saw them as either animals or children. They needed a caretaker, someone to look out for them, because they weren't able to handle their own affairs. So it says, in the same move, all their rights were apparently placed in the hands of their owners, who now became their curators or guardians. The enforcement of this new reglement was actively hindered, as Dutch historian Susan Legeen shows. 4 years later, a group of Suriname planters revoked the measure, using the opportunity of a change in local authority. Moreover, the protection of the enslaved was also revoked. The idea of slaves as minors would return soon, however. New rules for the registration of slaves were announced, presented as part of the legislation against the slave trade, and aimed at collecting more tax from the owners of slaves. It says detailed legislation shows to what extent one dividing line defined the social structure in the colony. Every single government service was calculated in separate prices and tariffs for 3 categories: white, freeman or freeman, and slave. Fees for slaves were always and everywhere lower, in order to signify that they were considered to be worth less. This division in 3 categories was applied uniformly for all fees and taxes, such as costs of medical treatments, burial, the questioning of subjects, the inspection of corpses, and the work of midwives. The cost of slaves were further calculated according to their age. Slaves from 8 to 14 are given half, and the younger ones are given 1/3 of the food rations. Listen, should the children be fed from the master's own table, they will be given nothing else. So let's get an idea of how profitable the slave trade was for them. This information comes from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History. It says the Dutch share in the Atlantic slave trade averaged about 5 to 6% of the total, but the volume differed sharply over time. The beginning of the Dutch transatlantic slave trade can be dated to 1636, after the Dutch West India Company had acquired its own plantation colony around Recife in Brazil. In order to set up a regular trade in slaves, the West India Company also took Elmina on the Gold Coast and Luanda in Angola from the Portuguese. The slave trade to Dutch Brazil was short-lived, and after the loss of Dutch Brazil and Luanda, the West India Company as well as private merchants from Amsterdam started to sell slaves to colonists in the Spanish, English, and French Caribbean via Curaçao. The West India Trade, or the West India Company, trade hub in the region. I'll drop down. It says between 1700 and 1725, after the Dutch had been banned from selling slaves in foreign colonies, the Dutch slave trade declined, but the volume increased again after 1730, when the West India Company lost its monopoly and private shipping companies were allowed to enter the trade. In addition, Amsterdam-based investors poured money into the Dutch plantation colonies, expecting windfall profits from a new cash crop, coffee. It says these profits did not materialize, and the majority of the planters in the Dutch plantation colonies went bankrupt. These bankruptcies, another war with Britain, and the French occupation caused the Dutch slave trade to decline sharply. The last Dutch slave ship sailed to Suriname in 1802. In 1814, the Dutch government yielded to British abolitionists and abolished the slave trade in the hope of regaining its colonial possessions occupied by Britain. And this is why they try to say they didn't really profit from the slave trade, but this was not the case. Now I want to show you how the Dutch enriched themselves through slavery in other ways. We're going to read some excerpts from this article from Rutledge, Taylor, and Francis Group entitled Underwriting Slavery, Insurance and Slavery in the Dutch Republic. So we're going to read this to see how the insurance industry was used for them to profit from slavery. So it says this article shows that slavery was more connected to Dutch society and economy than has been previously assumed. It does so by investigating the people involved in Dutch slavery insurance in the period 1718 to 1734, when the Dutch slave trade was monopolized by the state-chartered West India Company, and the period 1763 to 1778, when the private slave trade reached its peak and slavery insurance was more common. It says this article analyzes a variety of primary sources that have not been studied in this light before. The analysis shows that a large and varied group was involved and that slavery insurance was not a regional institution that only affected the Dutch colonies. It says no maritime trade can be done or exists if the merchant or negotiator does not assure and insure his ship and cargo against the dangers of the sea, such as wars and pirating. This quote comes from draft regulations from 1720 of an insurance company in the Dutch Republic. It illustrates the importance of insurance for managing the risk and for the continuation of any maritime trade. This was true as well for the slave-based trade, such as the slave trade and the colonial trade in coffee, cotton, and sugarcane, crops produced by enslaved Africans on American plantations. Insurers facilitated the slave-based trade, and by doing so, they contributed to the existence and continuation of slavery. It says, over the past few decades, Dutch historians have become increasingly interested in the history of slavery. However, slavery insurance, despite its importance for the slave trade, is still not completely understood. In order to understand this, it is important to first discuss the general Dutch historiography on slavery. Dutch historiography has not provided insights into the background of the slavery insurers, since Dutch scholars have focused on analyzing the profits of trading companies and the individuals directly involved in the slave trade and colonial plantations. Several historians argue that slavery was of negligible importance to the Dutch Republic as a whole, since slave trading companies were not very profitable and the number of people directly involved was small. This has led them to conclude that slavery was of marginal importance to the Dutch economy. For them, it neither impacted nor penetrated Dutch society as a whole, but was a regional institution only essential for the Dutch colonies far away from the so-called motherland. So let's see if this is true. It says several historians stress that the Atlantic slave trade was of a much greater importance to the Dutch economy than previously assumed. It says involvement in the Atlantic slave-based economy might have been the key to its sustained economic growth in the 18th century. Furthermore, Dutch merchants were active providers of plantation loans in the Dutch Caribbean in the 18th century and confiscated the enslaved Africans when debts remained unpaid. And now we see how they were making money on the back end. Let's go on. It says the risk associated with maritime trade, such as piracy and storms, were of great concern to Dutch merchants and ship owners. The ship and its inventory were insured in a hull or casco insurance, and the shipload in a cargo or carousel insurance. Cargo insurances were more common than hull insurances, especially when the cargo was valuable. Enslaved Africans were valuable cargo, and the value of their lives could therefore be included in the cargo insurance policy. So it really didn't matter to them if they had to throw human beings overboard. Why would it matter if you know that you're going to get paid on the back end? There was absolutely no care or concern because they didn't see them as humans. So the conclusion is that slavery insurance reduced the financial risk of the slave trade and slavery. And so it facilitated its continuation. It showed that a number of the major insurance brokers in the Dutch Republic were involved in the insurance of slave ships. You would need that in order for this to be a profitable venture, right? So a large group of underwriters had to be involved in this process. I hope you all see the hand of Esau written all over this. Let's wrap up with this passage from Isaiah 49:22 through 26. Thus says the Most High, Behold, I will lift up mine hand to the Gentiles and set up my standard to the people. So there is going to be a day of reckoning for all of those nations that used, abused, exploited, and erased our people for centuries. It says, and they shall bring thy sons in their arms, and thy daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders, and kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and their queens thy nursing mothers. This is telling us that the wealth and riches are coming back to us. And kings thy nursing fathers, think about that. You don't see a man nursing a baby. So this is talking about the substance, the wealth of these nations. It says, they shall bow down to thee with their face toward the earth and lick up the dust of thy feet. And thou shalt know that I am the Most High. He says, they shall not be ashamed that wait on me. So even though the road gets hard, it's been hard. He said, you will not be ashamed when you wait for him. Wait for him to deliver you, and don't try to do it in your own strength. Trying to do it our own way has not worked for us. It has failed time and time again. He said, no one will deliver you. We couldn't even deliver ourselves. So we need to wait for him. Listen to verse 24. Shall the prey be taken from the mighty, or the lawful captive delivered? Pay attention to this. Shall the prey be taken from the mighty? If you've been following this series, it is without question that we have been prey for the Gentile nations. They have ruled over us with rods of iron. But the question is being asked as if to say, who will deliver us from their hand? Who will deliver us? Listen to what it says next. Or the lawful captive delivered. Why does it say a lawful captive? A lawful captive is one whom the conqueror had a right to take. It's like someone who refuses to obey the laws of the land, and he goes before the judge, and a sentence is handed down of 10 years in prison. Once the sentence is handed down, the handcuffs will be placed on you, and you will be carried away to serve your time. Pause and think on that. The Most High turned us over to our oppressors because we were judged for our wickedness. So let's ask the question again. Shall the prey be taken from the mighty? Shall the lawful captive be delivered? Listen to the Most High's response. But thus says the Most High, even the captives of the mighty shall be taken away, and the prey of the terrible or the mighty shall be delivered. For I will contend with him that contendeth with thee, and I will save thy children, and I will feed them that oppress thee with their own flesh. And they shall be drunken with their own blood, as with sweet wine, and all flesh shall know. All flesh shall know that I, the Most High, am thy Savior and thy Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob. I hope you heard that. This is what you need to understand, Israel. Yah is the righteous judge, the almighty king, and our Father. So when we read scripture, we need to read it with that in mind. As righteous judge, he handed us over for breaking his laws. As king, he has the authority to command those who took us into captivity to let us go. It's as if he says, okay, you've held them long enough. Let them go. As Father, he's going to contend with those who mistreated his children, even though we messed up. The heart of the Father says, what you did to my children, you did it to me, and I'm coming for you. This is an aspect of the Father that the Gentiles can't seem to understand. He is going to contend with them because they oppressed his children. So if you have a problem with that, take it up with him. We didn't write these words. He said it. I'm going to contend with him that contend with you. So we will end it there for this session. As a reminder, please remember to join me for the live. If this message has been a blessing to you, remember to hit the like, share it, and you are welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. Join me next time. Be blessed, family.